Today's video is sponsored by Atlas and Sega.
'Tis a grievous tale which speaks of Fevrith, one of stolen destiny, stolen minds, and stolen nations.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Based on a recent community poll that I did, I know a decent chunk of you can relate to me here. I've personally spent thousands of hours playing strategy games with a pretty clear preference leaning towards specific types of games in the genre. But to be honest, there's a handful of titles in a sub-genre of strategy, and I'm talking like icons really. I'm thinking Final Fantasy Tactics, Triangle Strategy, Fire Emblem, Tactics Ogre, that for some reason have just never clicked with me. Now don't get me wrong, I fully recognize their brilliance, for lack of a better term. They have incredible storytelling with all this political intrigue, and they've got very passionate communities around these games as well. These are, of course, some of the reasons that drew me to these games in the first place, but whether it was the pacing or the storytelling or maybe just the timing in my own personal life, they just didn't resonate with me as much as I wanted them to. Enter Unicorn Overlord. This is releasing on March 8th on the Switch, the PS4, the PS5, and both the Xbox Series X and S. Initially, I approached the demo with the same sort of skepticism that I've had for those other games, wondering if it would be another title that I would essentially add to my, yeah, that's great, but I'll just appreciate it from afar list that is ever growing. But obviously, for the first time ever in my life, I was completely wrong. Speaking of the demo, it's one of the most feature-complete demos that gives you 5 hours of playtime to do almost anything that you want. Time spent in menus and the incredible in-game archive, and I'll talk about that more later, doesn't count towards that time limit either. Now, what sets Unicorn Overlord apart for me isn't just its cool mechanics or how gorgeous it is, and trust me, those are big parts of it, but it's how the game feels accessible, yet really deep. It's innovative in a way that I haven't experienced before, but it's still familiar in other aspects. And it bridges these sort of gaps that I didn't realize were there in my own personal strategy game experiences. From the get-go, Unicorn Overlord respects your time and it respects your intelligence, which I appreciate. It introduces these really complex systems in a way that's digestible but never dumbed down. If you guys have watched my channel for any length of time, you've heard me talk about how important tutorials are, and this game just absolutely nails it. The game loop itself is very satisfying. It rewards your strategic and creative thinking. It rewards your ability to adapt in a way that felt really fun for me, somebody that has played a lot of strategy games in the past. So let's talk about the game loop a little bit here. You're gonna find yourself navigating what's called the overworld in search of facilities, think things like towns or forts, to liberate and help them. Doing so will provide you with the ability to recruit soldiers or mercenaries, gather resources, of course, and just do things that will make your journey a little bit more efficient. However, as you're exploring this overworld, you're going to find battle stages, and that's where the real meat of the game is. In a battle stage, you'll have various objectives. Early on, the most common is to fight and defeat a boss unit, while at the same time making sure that your command post itself isn't captured. And that's easier said than done, because you're going to be engaged in some real-time area control stuff that requires very careful planning and even more careful execution. Some questions that I found myself asking is, okay, is there a guard tower stuck across a river that I can't cross and it's supporting enemy units in fights? How am I going to deal with that? Are the enemy command posts planning to deploy more units, or are they planning to spend valor to cast an ability? Or are they healing whoever's garrisoned in that building right now? What about all the units between me and the enemy? How do I deal with them and make sure I don't run out of stamina so that my units would just be standing there defenseless and ultimately ripe for the slaughter? You get good. That's how you do it. You gotta get good. How do you do that? You practice. And it brings me to my favorite part of the game. First of all, there's an extremely robust rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock, if that's your thing, situation going on here. But like, add way more options to that. From my understanding, there's about 60 class variants in the game. each with their own unique strengths, weaknesses, and leader abilities. Just in the demo alone, I tried anything from lords to legionnaires, hoplites to housecarls, and fighters to feather swords. If you're like, what the heck are those? Yeah, well, I'll give you one example. As a brief demonstration, let's look at feather swords. This is a class I got later into the demo, and it was necessary for an upcoming fight because, yes, of course, when you get a new unit, the game is going to show you some amazing scenarios in which they will be helpful. Feather swords class trait is a 2x dodge rate versus grounded melee units. They also ignore terrain and trap effects when you're moving, and they grow stronger in daylight battles. That being said, any type of anti-flying enemy unit, like hunters with their True Strikes ability, will basically decimate them. Okay, so how does the combat actually work? Because I feel like the phrase auto battler often carries this unintended connotation, and it's like something you're gonna hear a character in Game of Thrones whispering to Littlefinger in like a back alley or something. But I feel like this game does it so much better. There's a lot more depth here, a lot more control. It's not just simply put your units against each other and see what happens. And this is all because of the game's tactics mechanic. Let me explain. See, in Unicorn Overlord, you're not just commanding units, but you're programming their actions. It's essentially orchestrating a symphony of these if-then statements that let you precisely choreograph your units' every move. Some of you may know this, but I'm a former financial analyst who spent years at a desk building and working with complex Excel formulas. So this is my jam. I love this kind of stuff. And if this sounds too complex for you, I just want to assure you, it's only as complex as you want to make it. First of all, you've got 3 difficulty modes to choose from. You've got story, tactical, and expert. I dove in on expert, as one does, and quickly was humbled. And I needed to utilize not just the tactics system, but also adjust my unit makeup, my positioning, my item usage. And I will say, just as with anything, any type of practice is just going to help you in no time. So I would recommend dive in, start on story or tactical, and just get a feel for how things work, experiment with these different mechanics, and before you know it, you're going to be fine. So your units are made up of individual combatants, which are placed on this 3x2 grid. And in essence, it works like this. Step 1, you can put combatants in the front or the back row. Step 2, enemies cannot hit the back row if there's anyone in the front row, except with a bow, magic, or piercing attacks. And 3, where you place combatants doesn't change how much damage they give or receive, but some special attacks do work differently depending on the row. So when you find yourself engaged in a fight with an enemy unit, you're able to adjust your unit formation, tactics, and you can use items before the fight. You can then simulate the battle, or you can watch it play out. And I cannot recommend enough how important it is to watch these battles play out, especially early on, or when you're experimenting with a different synergy or a formation or different commands or different tactics that you've chosen. You'll get a much better insight into the flow of battle. Basically, you want to be asking, is the tactic system that I put in place working as intended, or does it need tweaking? And for me, unfortunately, the answer is almost always the latter. I was constantly tweaking and trying to figure out the optimal tactics to use and the right positioning and the right synergies. It's an absolute blast trying to do that too. The cool thing is, you can then view a combat log that breaks down every attack one at a time. And it's pretty digestible too, because fights aren't always fights to the death. As a simplistic explanation here, combat ends when each combatant has used its active and its passive ability, or a whole team is wiped out. Now, the reason it's important to watch the fights play out and analyze the outcome is due to the way that default targeting works in the game. Essentially, skills automatically target the nearest ally or enemy in the front row of the targeted unit. Attack skills always aim for the enemy directly in front of the user first. If no one is there, they target the next nearest enemy. If a skill has a special condition, like targeting cavalry, for example, it targets the closest enemy that meets this condition first. If there's several targets that meet the criteria equally, then the skill's target is chosen randomly. And lastly, some conditions can change the targeting order, but you can learn about those more on your own because it can get pretty complex there. Now, unless your unit is garrisoned or being impacted by some sort of special ability, you're going to lose a point of stamina after each engagement. And managing your unit's stamina is really critical to the success of the battle stage itself, because you've got a time limit in which it takes to complete the entire stage. There's been a lot of times where I'm right down to the wire and it makes some really stressful but obviously rewarding moments if you come out on top of that. I can see though that some people might not enjoy this time limit aspect hanging over their heads, but at least let me reassure you that the time isn't moving while you're paused and you're planning out your actions. It's only moving when things are actively taking place on the battle stage itself. So what's the point of all this? I'm going to touch on the lore and the story shortly, but early on at least, the point is to level up your units, find new recruitable classes, bolster your resources, namely your gold, your honor, and your renown. Now, gold is used as you would expect. You're buying new weapons, you're buying armor, you're buying consumables. Honors, however, this is used to recruit new units, or mercenaries as they're called, which are pretty customizable with one caveat. You're going to have a predetermined, albeit quite long list of names to choose from. So you're not going to be able to have like Smokey Joe 69 in your Liberation army, at least for now. You also use Valor to expand your unit size, which initially starts at 2, and also to increase the amount of units that you can have and deploy. Expanding your unit size is actually a huge leap in power for that individual unit group because of the way that combat works, like I explained earlier. When you're moving from 2 up to 3 combatants in your party, that's going to take you from 2 active skills and 2 passive skills per fight, up to 3 active skills and 3 passive skills per fight, and then to 4 and 4, and so on. So it's a big boost in power. Lastly, Renown increases the range of services at forts, and it grants you access to the best gear, upgrades, etc. Let's touch on the story in Unicorn Overlord. None of this is going to include any major story spoilers. The only things we're talking about are parts that are shown relatively early on in the demo. And when I first heard about this, I was like, what is Unicorn Overlord anyways? Like, what is that? Long story short, Elaine, our main character, and a ring called the Unicorn Ring was entrusted to Joseph. He's a basically general of our mother's army. Our mother is named Elenia, and she puts up this final stand versus a traitor named Valmor, who ultimately defeats her. Now, he later changes his name to Emperor Galerius for reasons, and we soon come to understand that Galerius learned to control people by essentially magic, and that led to him being able to conquer and command all of the realms within Fevrith, which is the name of the continent that we're on. So 10 years after this happens, we're obviously an older, wiser, more skilled Elaine, and we get the ring back, and we learn that according to legend, it purifies evil or darkness. So this means that we can actually remove the control that Galerius has over the leaders of the different realms. So our main driving force now is trying to understand why Galerius's army, called the Zenoirans, have captured our friend Scarlet. We don't know why this has happened. We're trying to find her, and we don't know what they want with her, what they're planning to do. Now, there's some obvious tropes in here, and I get the impression that we're going to have some cool twists and turns, but I don't foresee it being a huge story of like political intrigue or something overly complex, although I am very happy to be wrong about that. Lastly, I mentioned that we're going to touch on the in-game archive. There's hundreds of names, locations, items, mechanics, relationships, like you name it, it's in there. And you're going to want to refer back to this on a regular basis to make sure that you're up on what's happening with the story and even the game mechanics if you want to revisit something you don't remember how it works. The archive is super easy to navigate. It's essentially a hyperlinked codex where you can follow keywords from any entry that leads you to other entries. I like to think of it as an interactable in-game Wikipedia. You can even replay cutscenes that were relevant to the entries. And personally, I think it's the best I've ever seen in any game ever. And this kind of stuff for me, like I love diving into that and understanding the backstories and all the characters. So this helps a ton with that. There's obviously way more to talk about that I haven't even touched on here. For example, there's a relationship system that helps you bolster unit stats based on the amount of time that they spend together. There's a ton of weapons and items that you can find that all have different status effects and interactions. There's overworld traps and things that you need to navigate. There's literally so much going on here that I could be here for 3 hours. And to be fair, like I'd be happy to do that. But YouTube doesn't seem to be the same type of fan of long videos as I am. That said, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to watch this. If you made it this far, I really appreciate that, since this isn't typically the style of video that I make. But whenever I get the urge to try something different like this, where I'll essentially script out my thoughts in advance instead of just doing a 1 hour, let's see how this is type of video, I get filled with these like huge amounts of self-doubt and criticism. So again, if you made it this far, like, that means the world to me, and drop the phrase in the comments below saying something like, I want to be a unicorn overlord, and then I'll know. That's my reassurance. Safe to say, honestly, I'm in love with this game. This is the one. This is the one that finally gripped me enough to want to play the whole thing. And if you guys are interested in watching me play it, I would love to make this a series on the channel, so let me hear that down below. Either way, I'm going to be playing this. Like, I've been playing it on the PS5, and I will be getting it on the Switch, and I will be consuming it immensely. It's going to be one that kind of takes over my life in any free time that I might have. I got a trip coming up. This is going to be perfect. I'm going to crush so much of this on the plane, and I can't wait for it, so I'm stoked. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a good one. I hope this gave you a good understanding of what this game is. I've been seeing so many little videos popping up in my feed lately about Unicorn Overlord, and it's like, I think this is going to be pretty solid. Maybe even a Game of the Year contender for a lot of people. So let me know what you think, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.